to my clock, it's ticked over to 11 o'clock, which is our start time for this webinar. So I'll get through the little housekeeping things while any additional people join in. Because most of us that are tuning in are from Australia, I thought it would be nice to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which many of us are currently based. Personally, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurrung and the Boiwurrung language groups of the Kulin Nations on whose unceded land I live and work. I wish to acknowledge their elders past, present and future. Then the usual technical housekeeping for a webinar. Please mute yourselves unless you need to speak. For Q&A or any questions throughout the session, you can unmute yourself or type into the chat box and I'll relay any questions to Rich. And then we get on to the webinar's start. So I guess I'll start by giving a bit of an introduction to who Rich is. So Rich recently retired after 16 years as e-resource systems manager at MIT Library. Before coming to MIT, he worked for 2 years at the Harvard University Library as a member of the Aleph implementation team. Prior to his work in libraries, Rich worked for 14 years at commercial software firms such as a systems programmer, a data center manager, and a product developer. So he's got a very wide range background. And I think most recently he's been very heavily involved in the work going on at the moment with RA21, which he's going to share some information about with us today. Over to you, Rich.
Thank you, Amelia, and good morning, everyone. And thanks for tuning in. Amelia has asked me to speak about these matters under the assumption that perhaps not much is known about the work that's been going on to supersede IP filtering. And so I'm going to try to do that and cover the early material at sort of a basic level. My apologies to you if you already know some of this, but I'd like to be as thorough as I can. We'll get through as much as we can in an hour. We may not get through all the material, just depends how fast we go, how many questions there are, and so on. So I'm going to assume from the outset that you all know what IP filtering is. For these purposes, it is, of course, the access method whereby a university, library, or subscriber of one sort or another registers a range of IP addresses with vendors. And whenever the vendor sees a connection from the IP addresses in those ranges, access to licensed content is granted unauthenticated and unauthorized. That's the sort of the bottom line of what we're talking about here. I need to say right up front that I am not a librarian by training, although I've been working in libraries now for quite some years, but I do need you to know that I am not a credentialed, I don't hold a degree in library science. And also I am retired and I do not speak for the MIT library in any way. It's likely that I'll have examples that will refer to MIT because that's where my primary experience is. But I do want to make clear that I am not on their payroll anymore and I am not speaking for them on policy matters, anything of the kind. This is what I'll try to cover. The project started really back in 2016 as RA21. It is now, the RA21 phase has ended this past June 30th. We're now into the seamless access phase. I'll say more about the difference between those, but as those terms roll by, they refer to the same project overall, just different phases of the project. I do hope to be able to show you a demo of some of the central services that are currently in beta status, if we get that far, and a few thoughts about some issues that are probably in our future. So looking back a bit, where did IP filtering come from? It came out of the earlier days of the internet, certainly in the 90s at some point. And it's useful to think back just a bit and realize that at that time the practice of IP filtering got started as online databases were new and online journals were brand new, and institutions were just then trying to figure out how to connect. That was a very different technical environment than we live in today. We didn't have portable devices then to speak of. Nobody had smartphones. Notepads weren't ubiquitous, and so on and so forth. It was a much different technical time. One of the characteristics of that time was that static IP addresses were primarily static, which is to say, a particular computer at a particular place had the same IP address today, tomorrow, next week, next year. Those didn't change. They were assigned in a static way, and they stayed that way. There are several unspoken assumptions that underlie what came to be called IP filtering. And it's important that I say here that even though I'm going to spend some time pointing out the difficulties that have accumulated with IP filtering over the years, that should not be understood to be a knock on the way it was set up in the early days. It made sense back then, but technology has passed it by in many, many ways, and that's what we'll need to talk about. What I call the march of technology. Technology changed at a rapid pace. Of course, you all know that. You've seen it happen, and it's happening right now. Certainly by the early 2000s, much of this was already underway. And certainly by now, portable PCs, portable devices of every kind, smartphones, and all the rest of it. Many, many devices that are connected to the network that didn't used to be connected. Part of that technological march was also dynamic IP address assignment, DHCP. It's likely the case at your institution, doesn't have to be, but it's very likely the case that at your institutions, most users, probably not everyone, but most users, workstations have an IP address that may be good for a couple of days or a week, and then they get a new one through the automated protocol. So IP addresses that were once fixed have long since ceased to be fixed. And probably the biggest game changer of them all was that users started to want to use the network to get access to electronic resources from off campus, as we call it, someplace other than in their office or in their classroom or in their library. This took off rapidly and is probably, in some sense, the biggest game changer that we need to point out. IP filtering, the model of IP filtering that was established in early days simply has no accommodation at all for that development. And so we did next best. I've called this playing games, and I'll try to be clear about what I mean by that. Our users began wanting to connect from off campus in large numbers. The IP filtering model had nothing, no ability at all to accommodate that need, just nothing at all, a blank where we needed to have something. And so we went upstream and began playing games, I call it, in order to accommodate the restrictions of the IP filtering model. primarily proxy servers and later VPN. Why do I call it playing games? Proxy servers and VPNs are first and foremost instruments of intentional deception. Not nefarious, of course, nothing of the kind, but proxy servers and VPNs are first and foremost there to assert that a user is located at a place where he or she is almost certainly not. That's what they're there for. Much else has been built around them and in them and so forth, but proxy servers are there to pretend in order to keep the IP filtering model working. So I'm going to use MIT as an example here, as a really simple example. For until a few years ago, MIT had a Class A network. The MIT address range, with a few labs left to the side, was 18. Star, an enormous address range. The view of the IP filtering model for vendors that MIT was connected to was simply this: if I see anybody coming from a 18 something IP address, they're good to go. That's it. And so we had proxy servers out there pretending, bringing people from Singapore and South Africa and Europe and everywhere else under the 18, the net 18 umbrella, just to get them connected to the vendors through IP filtering. So we had to play this game. And it was wildly successful as far as it went. I mean, proxy servers are deeply embedded in our environments, of course. For a while, we kind of thought we were good to go, I guess. Their virtualization is happening at any number of levels in various technologies over time. And it is certainly the case that networks themselves are no longer as static as they once were. And again, I'll just use a local example. MIT is on the way toward, they're slowly implementing a network arrangement whereby the network IP range on campus is not at all what the network IP range is off campus. On campus, users are at 10 something. External ones are still at 18 something. The ranges have changed some in the last few years. Talk more about that later. So these things are, these IP addresses are being changed by network address translation on the fly. This isn't something that's cut over and then it's static. It's on the fly. So, and of course, it's obvious that IP filtering, this confuses the information about network addresses and or IP addresses and what they mean even more. So here's the bottom line as I see it. Remember I said a couple slides ago that there are some assumptions built into the IP filtering model. And the very first one is IP filtering is built on the idea that an IP address reliably indicates a user's physical location. And that's not just in some sort of general, kind of vague or virtualized way. In the 90s, when this was put together, a particular, 18.3.4.5 would have pointed to a specific place. In other words, MIT campus in Cambridge, Mass, a specific building, a specific floor, a specific office, and a specific desktop machine. That's how explicit it was. That's just, as we have just shown, that it's utterly false. It's just, once in a while it's true, of course, but that notion is just built on sand. It is no longer the case. The IP filtering model doubles down on that prior assumption and makes the further assumption that a physical location that we know because we have an IP address, and we know that that's no longer true, physical location reliably indicates an authenticated, authorized user. And that is just nonsense in today's world. It certainly does not. So this model has had the base just cut out from under it by the advancing technological change over the past decade or two. And yet here we are with it deeply embedded in our institutions. I don't know about your area, but certainly in North America, it's a good guess that more than 90% of electronic resources at academic libraries are still being IP filtered. The third point I'll make is the one here. IP filtering, even if its assumptions were true, is about where a user is or was, not who the user is. All three of these things are things that we need to, are reasons why we need to shift to a more, a model that sits more comfortably and more robustly in our technological space in 2019. So this is just a wrap up. IP filtering conflates IP address with location identity. It requires proprietary portals. Now, what do I mean by that? It's important to understand this. Right now, if a student or faculty member at a university goes out to Google Scholar, does a search, finds an article pointing to a vendor, and follows the link to that vendor, good chance, if that's licensed content, they're going to hit a paywall. The only thing that they can do at that point is to abandon that effort, go back and connect through their institution's portal and any pre-qualification like proxy servers and so forth that that institution might have in place, then repeat the search under those auspices, and then finally get to licensed content. That's a terrible user experience, but that's what IP filtering has brought us to. And that is in direct opposition to modern discovery practices. So, and of course it made sense in the beginning. We all had to set up things our own way for our own institutions, and so our proprietary portals became primary. That is to say, we were saying to our students, faculty, and the world, you have to come to us first. If you want to get in on this access to electronic licensed resources, you have to start with us, and then we'll see to it that things line up in such a way that you can get to those things. That is not the way discovery is working in the world today, and hasn't for quite some time. IP filtering can be a maintenance nightmare. Now, if you're in a university that where things are really, really static and don't change much, you may not have seen this so much. But I've seen it in spades. What do I mean? What happens if your IP address ranges change? Your network undergoes some reorganization, or your university merges with another and you get part of a different network and so forth. Again, I'll refer to MIT as an example. MIT has roughly 450 vendors with whom they have their IP address ranges registered. 3 years ago, remember I talked about that big Class A IP address range. 3 years ago, part of that range was sold. And suddenly our IP address ranges weren't the same anymore. The librarians had to contact 450 vendors one by one to ask them to change those IP address ranges. An enormous amount of staff time and potential for errors and unanswered emails and all the rest of it. It gets worse. The following year, the network changed again for similar reasons. And so the libraries did it all over again. And when I say staff work, I'm talking about multiple people working across about 5 months to get all of that done. And it gets worse. The third year, the network changed again. So in that particular case, and I hope it's not the case in your location, but MIT has gone through that exercise 3 times in 3 consecutive years. It is not a scalable model. It just isn't. That's no way to run a railroad, as the saying goes. And one thing we haven't talked about yet, but IP filtering in the modern age is just a sieve. It's full of holes. It leaks data all over the place without our even knowing it. University networks are ridiculously easy to penetrate. IP addresses can be spoofed. Students can open a Tor exit facility and open your entire licensed content to the world. It's just that the notion that we can continue to pretend that we can carve a safe space out where authorization and authentication just doesn't even have to apply. It just doesn't apply anymore. It made sense probably in the early days, but it hasn't made sense for quite a long time. And just with the footnote here, one of the consequences of the leakage of data is Sci-Hub. Whatever you feel about Sci-Hub and so forth, that's where most of that data is coming from. So stepping back just a little bit, there's lots of details here, of course, but there are two primary streams of concern that we have with IP filtering. One is that we need to improve the user experience. We just talked through that example of the search that has to come back into the proprietary portal. And the other is that we really do need to respond to the security deficits. It's that we live now in the most toxic internet environment that any of us have ever seen, and we just cannot keep pretending that that's not the case. So here are a couple of things that will improve the user experience. And I've touched on this first one a little bit. The point of referral for authentication has to be moved. Right now, as I said, with proxy servers being the primary access point for IP filtering for off-campus people, people have to come to us first. That is, they have to come to our institution's portal, and there we do whatever authentication we're going to do. And that's just the wrong place for it, given the way discovery works. The decision about whether or not this user needs to be authenticated needs to move out of our portals and out to the provider's sites. So back to the example, the scholar who does a search in Google Scholar follows a link to a vendor for an article. When he gets to that vendor's site, that is the point at which the vendor needs to say, this is licensed content. I don't know who this is. We need to authenticate this person. And we'll talk about what the process is for doing so. But conceptually, I hope you get that that's a major change in the way we think about how we provision resources. Institutional affiliate, this is a little ahead of the story, but institutional affiliation defaults, when that user goes out to the vendor site and the vendor says, I need to authenticate this person, they'll go through a process where they say where they want to authenticate at, which institution, and they will be sent there to authenticate with university credentials and then come back to full text. That selection of the institution where the person wants to authenticate at needs to persist. In other words, if you're somebody who works on Science Direct most days, day after day after day, you don't want to have to go through that select your institution step every time. That's just wasted effort. You'd like to select it one time and have it persist as a choice after that. And that's one of the things that RE21 is doing. And of course, we need to support all devices. Mobile needs to be supported every bit as well as static, desktop devices and so on. All this is as you would expect. Patrons' privacy needs to be preserved, and we need to think much more seriously about patron privacy than IP filtering has led us to believe. We'll say more about that later, but patron privacy is a big part of the RE21 project, as we'll see. Security, as I mentioned before, we need to focus on who the patron is, and let me quickly say that that does not mean releasing personally identifying information to a vendor. It does not. We'll see more about what that does mean, but we need to talk about who we're dealing with, not where they are, because there's no way for us to know where they are. And of course, a part of all of this is that users should be able to use university credentials rather than having to set up new credentials for every vendor that they connect to. That's a really old idea. The third point here, I won't drill in on the detail on this, but one of the downsides of IP filtering, especially when you've got lots of sessions aggregated behind a proxy server, is that if there's inappropriate use on any session, what gets shut off by the vendor? An IP address. And in that case, it's the IP address of your proxy server, and just like that, that vendor's material is not available to any of your off-campus folks. That happens a lot, and it's just not a good user experience, and we shouldn't have to be still living with something that crude. With the connections that I'm sketching here that RE21 is talking about, which we'll see in a minute, it comes under the heading of Federated Identity Management, that wouldn't happen. Instead, individual sessions could be blocked. If a session, a particular user is misbehaving, that session could be blocked without blocking anybody else. Single sign-on, I'm assuming that you probably know what that means. That simply means that once you've authenticated in a browser session, you shouldn't have to keep authenticating. If you go to another vendor or another system that needs authentication, single sign-on carries your credentials along as long as you don't close that browser session. So the way forward, I've already spoken about this, Federated Identity Management robustly implemented by both subscribers and providers. In North America, at least, I'm not sure about your area, certainly the most well-known system that does this is Shibboleth. There are others, but I may speak using Shibboleth as an example just because it's kind of the one that most people have heard of or know something about. So what is Federated Identity Management, and what makes it up? First off, it's SAML-based. SAML is Security Assertion Markup Language. It's a highly secure, stable way of exchanging identity and authentication information between a vendor and a subscriber. It's open source. It has been around since the early 2000s, and it works very well and is installed many places. Another part of Federated Identity Management, in fact, the federated part, is federated metadata, and this is really important. In order to set up one of these connections, and I'll just use made up names for the purpose. Let's say we've got vendor A who publishes some database or journal that the library wants to subscribe to. In order to connect to it in a federated identity management fashion, both of the vendor system and the library or the institution's IT group need to exchange a few pieces of metadata. In other words, if it were MIT, the MIT campus IT group needs to know a couple of things about vendor A, and vendor A needs to know a couple of things about MIT's setup. And once they've exchanged those bits of metadata, now they've got a trusted connection and they're good to go from now on. That exchange is kind of a one-time thing. It once in a while needs to be redone, but not very often. So there's this initial setup. A small amount of metadata needs to be exchanged with each vendor. Now, you can quickly see how unscalable it would be if every vendor needed to make a bilateral point-to-point connection to exchange that metadata with every customer. There would be this many-to-many relationship that would just just be wildly impossible and complex. And that is where federations came from. Federations are an agreement that all members will agree to certain standards of implementation and so forth, but primarily the members, both subscribers and providers, agree to post their metadata online in a repository that the federation manages. That way, any new vendor who needs to hook up to your institution simply can go to that site, download, assuming they're a member of the federation, download the appropriate metadata. Your institutions can do exactly the same thing, and the scaling problem just disappears. Out in the cloud, it's available to both. Let me quickly put two terms into the conversation here just to make sure that we're communicating. And this is Shibboleth speak. I won't go deeply into this at all. Vendors and providers are what Shibboleth would consider, or federated ID management systems in general would consider, a service provider, SP, you often see them called. And that can be a little confusing, but what that means is that on the vendor's site, that particular bit of Shibboleth code is providing services to systems and processes on the vendor site. The vendor has all kinds of things running, and whenever it needs authentication services, it can get them through this Shibboleth bit of code that's called the service provider on its site. On the institution side is where the far more heavyweight component is, called an identity provider, IDP. The IDP is where your institution's credentials are served from. And so all kinds of systems can connect to Shibboleth's backend. So you could have any number of authentication systems, doesn't matter. Shibboleth takes responsibility for communicating with the SP appropriately, depending on whatever authentication requirements your institution has. And it also is fully in control of any information that's sent back to the provider. So that's, the institution remains firmly in control. The IDP is where this control resides, and we can say a lot more about this later, but I want to emphasize it here that privacy concerns come up here, and it is within the institution's power to decide whether or not they want to, say, release a user's email address to the vendor or not, and so on. Much more to be said about privacy later. We covered this authentication at the point of need using institutional credentials, support for affiliation at multiple institutions. That's also an important one. Certainly visiting scholars and any number of researchers may have credentials at more than one university or institution. It should be possible for them to navigate this landscape to whichever institution they have credentials at without any difficulty at all. RA21 started in late 16 and ended in June of 2019 to address all of these matters. We spent, when I say we, I mean academic libraries, have spent a good part of the last 2 decades waiting for something to happen, and vendors too. And I say that because federated identity management has been around, for the better part of the last 2 decades, but its uptake was remarkably slow, partly because nobody was really pushing for it or asking for it or something, and partly because it did have some characteristics that did not make the user experience quite as good as it needed to be. So we're playing catch up here, and RA21 is a collaboration between publishers and libraries and corporate subscribers over the last, since late 2016, to try to do 2 big things. One is to assemble a detailed recommended set of best practices so that we have something uniform to work off of rather than every subscriber and every provider just kind of making all this stuff up on their own. And the other was to spin up a small set of lightweight central services hosted by a nonprofit consortium to fix those problems with the user experience that I just mentioned. And we'll say a little bit more about what those are. I wonder if I ought to stop here and just check whether questions are queuing up or there's anything that anybody wants to have clarified.
There's no questions in the chat, but if anyone has anything they'd like to ask, they can pop it in the chat or unmute yourself.
Okay, fair enough. I'll proceed, but if you do have questions or comments, why do utilize the chat. Before I leave this slide, let's just talk a little bit more about the last point. Again, think with me as we have our imaginary researcher, does a search in Google Scholar, sees an article, follows the link to that article, and gets to a vendor site, and the vendor system steps in and says, before we go on, you need to authenticate. Where would you like to authenticate? That's called a WAIF menu. Where are you from? That's what WAIF means. And it's simply a list of universities and institutions that support federated identity management. So when if I were an MIT user, I would get to the site, and the vendor site would say, excuse me, you need to authenticate. Here's a list. Click the one you want to authenticate on. I would click MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I would then, the next thing I would see would be my institution's regular login. I would log in with my regular institutional credentials, and the next thing I would see after that is full text of the article I was after. One of the services that, and this is optional, but one of the services that is being spun up in beta right now and is in fact active right now, we'll talk more about that later if we have time, is a standardized WAIF menu. Certainly every vendor, every SP can put their own menu up. But if you think about it, almost all of them will have the same or similar content. And so there will be 13 different spellings and abbreviations in use for one thing and another. A standardized WAIF menu would just be a way to do all that stuff in one place, put some search tools there as well, so to make it really quick and easy for you to find your institution on that list. So that's the first of the services. That's optional, doesn't have to be used, but it can be used. The second one is much more important, and that is once you have made a choice on that menu, you'd like to have it remembered so that next time you don't have to go through the menu. Who should remember that? If your vendor is going to remember it, now you've got, you know, is that a privacy leak or not? And would every vendor have to store that same choice and so forth? It's a really muddy, murky area. And the best answer is vendors shouldn't be in the business of that at all. We should be able, your browser should be able to remember your choice, unless you don't want it to, without the vendors being involved at all. And so the central service will do that for you. The central service will store a bit of data in your browser local storage, and the vendor will have no access to it. Nobody out there except the central service will communicate with your browser about that choice. Taking a bit of a jump here, that's sort of background and the beginnings of the project. RA21 ended by getting NISO, that's the National Information Standards Organization in North America, by getting certification of a set of best practices that both vendors and subscribers can implement to meet these goals. And the idea, you should understand that a lot of work has been put into these recommendations on much detail, and you can go out there and read them for yourselves. I hope you do. But more importantly, as this gets taken up among vendors and subscribers, it is highly useful to have a standard to refer to rather than just sort of making it up as you go, each vendor and each subscriber. So if you are talking to vendors about this, point them to these recommendations, ask them to implement them, or at least use them as a starting point for negotiation and so on. RE21 officially ended in June, and seamlessaccess.org started up at the same time. It's mostly the two things that are different. It's the same people, the same effort primarily. It's a rebranding, and it's also a movement from building the central services and the recommended best practices to actual operational beta status. So a beta service is being stood up right now, and in fact it's already in use in limited cases, and will be more so shortly, I think. This beta status will run to June of 2020, at which point we hope to be in full production. And I think pretty well covered a lot of this. Here's a link to the I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit so we can at least see at least a partial demo. Here's a link to the NISO document, a link to the source code of the central services, certified set of best practices to which we can refer. The NISO certified best practices, I'm not going to go in them in detail here, just I'm going to, you can go read them for yourself, but they cover in detail privacy and security and user experience and governance, and so on. And they do this with a fairly broad brush. That is, they are done not just with North America in mind, but with GDPR compliance and so on. A fairly broad range of opinion has been brought into this. So please do have a look at it. A summary is, as I emphasized before, you got to do this in a federated way. If you're trying to do this stuff without being a part of a federation, it's just not suitable and not scalable, although there are people out there who are trying to do it on the cheap. If you're in some situation or place where there just aren't federations, consider building one. Really pay attention to privacy. Improve the user experience with the two services I mentioned. Looking ahead and just try to standardize metadata quality and so on. Some of these others are somewhat in the future. Establishing a security incident reporting framework and so forth. That's ahead of us. Much of this is ahead of us, but it is in the document as areas that need to be worked on at the appropriate time. I will also mention here that the best practices include an endorsement of the GEONT Data Protection Code of Conduct. This is a very specific GDPR document. You should take some time to work through this. It takes privacy, user privacy, data privacy, very seriously indeed. So if you come across, and you will see in a few places, some naysayers out there that are saying, this effort is just a bunch of vendors trying to put one over on us, and et cetera, et cetera. It's not. I wouldn't be a part of this if it were. And I will tell you that from what I've seen, the recommendations of the best practices that were certified by NISO take user privacy and data privacy much more seriously than many of our libraries do. This is pretty much more of the same. We're talking here, I think, primarily about academic libraries, but this whole infrastructure applies far broader than just libraries. It applies to research writ large and so on. Here are just some examples of that. And these are some of the major touchstones that were a part of the effort. You can read this. I don't need to recite it to you. But transparency, I will underline that one. This work that the project is doing is transparent. It's open. You can find out who's working on it, what the approach is. You see the source code. You can see the founding documents and all the rest of it. Last one, there's collaboration here among many, many people and organizations, and here are just a few of them. More about research infrastructure. And if I'll just refer back when I said, when you come through this process the first time, you have to go through a WAIF menu that you would see this button here the first time through. After that, all the other times, if you've already made a selection of a place where you want to authenticate each time, that will come up right here. That's the persistence feature of the central service. And I'll try to show you that in the real live demo. This is the schedule. I've already mentioned that. We're in seamless access beta phase right now until end of June 2020. And here's, I'm going to step through a brief demo, and let me say right off the bat that this whole project is moving very quickly, and so when certain things work and when they don't and so forth is this is beta, okay? So the page you're not able to see the page that I'm looking at right now, are you?
Rich, no, we're not.
Okay.
Your demo is opened on another view or another screen.
Right, let me try to reset the share. I may have to step out of this.
While you're playing with that, Rich, we have a question in the chat. Where does OpenAthens fit into this? Is that just an implementation of RA21?
Great question. Just before I answer that, do you see my page now, a Google Scholar page?
Yes, I do. Excellent.
Okay. Great question. OpenAthens. Yeah, OpenAthens has been a part of and is still a part of this effort. OpenAthens, I'm not an expert on OpenAthens, but OpenAthens can work fine in this environment. You can, it's my understanding that OpenAthens can run more or less natively, or you can connect it to your Shibboleth infrastructure if you already have one. So yes, OpenAthens plays very nicely here. You should understand that you don't have to run OpenAthens in order to get a federated identity environment running. Shibboleth will do that for you at no cost other than your learning curve and so forth. But OpenAthens, of course, does bring a lot of value-added features and so forth. So the answer to the question in general is OpenAthens plays very nicely in this environment. They've been a part of developing it. Okay, the page you're looking at right now is a screen grab of a Google Scholar search. It is not, in fact, live, but the things that come next will be, or most of them, and I'll point them out. So I've done a search, back to our example, done a search, and I got something I'd like to follow, and I'm going to follow this. Do you see my browser page now?
Yes, we do.
And do you see the button that says access through your institution?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay, just to repeat, we followed a search directly to a vendor site. The vendor is not showing us anything except the abstract, and it says basically by putting this button up, we need to authenticate you before we can take you to your full text. Click this button, which I'm going to do, and this right now, what you're looking at is the central service WAF menu. So I'm going to do a search here, and where is it? Here it is, and I'm going to authenticate at MIT. That's the standard login page at MIT. Two-factor authentication.
I'll just give you your 10-minute warning, Rich, while you
Okay,
finish your authentication.
thank you. And we're back, and here's a PDF for full text. This page is again a mock-up, but never mind. That's the general way that it will work. So I'm going to close this browser. Are you again seeing the Google Scholar page?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Yep, seeing the Google Scholar page now.
Good. So this is right back what we just did. We're doing exactly the same thing over again. I went home for the night, let's say, and I'm back, and it's morning, and I'm opening my browser, and I decided to go back in and have another look at this. And I go in. Do you see what's changed here? Before it just said access through your institution. Now it gives me the choice of just clicking Massachusetts Institute of Technology because I chose that from the WAF menu before. It was stored, and I don't have to go choose it again. And we're back to full text. I hope the point of that came across, and that was simply that choosing off of a WAF menu is a one-time thing unless you need to change it for some reason or another. By the way, once your choice from the WAF menu is stored in your browser, if you clear your browser, it goes away. So you can get rid of it if you like. And I think at some point in the near future, you will have a choice whether, let's say you have really high levels of privacy concerns and you don't ever want that choice to be stored in your browser, you will be able to prevent that from happening. It's just we're early days in the system here yet. Okay, I'm going to close this browser. And I'm going to open another one. How much time do I have yet, Amelia?
You've got another 6 minutes.
Okay, I'll end with this. Be right with you. You should be seeing nature.com.
Yes, I am. And we also have a question on the chat. Is the selected WAIF institution stored in a cookie?
I can't tell you that for sure without getting a little more detail that I have to get back to you on. It's in browser local storage. What I don't know is if that structure that it's in is technically referred to as a cookie or not, but I can certainly find that out.
We're seeing your
Okay.
emails at the moment. Is that what you want us to see?
No, but I know I probably couldn't help that. You should be back to Springer Nature. I'm
Not
sorry.
yet.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. Oops, that's not the right one either. Sorry.
Yes, we're back to nature now.
Okay, so this is actually live. Springer Nature has just gone live yesterday or today with this with this system. And so I'm daring to do a live demo here, but this is everything you're seeing right now is live, just of the last day or two. I'm just on the nature.com site. I've done a particular search here, and I've got an article that I would like to read. And look what just happened here. Access through your institution. This is exactly the way this is supposed to work. Now, I'm going to disappoint you here because it turns out that MIT, where I have credentials, doesn't subscribe to this particular journal or database, and so I can't go beyond this point. But if I could, you would just see me go to MIT, log in, and come back to the article. More importantly, I encourage you to experiment with this yourself if your institution subscribes to Nature Research. So you can actually do this right now. Springer Nature is the very first one to step up and say, we're going to implement these recommendations and begin to build out this infrastructure on our side. So this is not canned stuff. You can go to nature.com. If your institution has a subscription, do a lookup and exercise this mechanism yourself. Okay, I'm going to put up a final slide, and that will be it. Let me try to get back to that.
So a question of my own, with what you were just showing with the Springer Nature and the WAIF authentication, is that just something that basically just Springer has had to do and our institution doesn't have to do any extra setup except for sign up with Springer Nature?
Yeah, I should have been a little more careful in that. It isn't necessarily, if your institution already does some kind of federated connection to nature, you shouldn't have to do anything. If you do not, then there probably will need to be a little bit of setup. Remember that reference to the metadata that comes from the Federation cloud and so forth. So yeah, I was a little probably a little ambitious there. It'll depend on whether or not your institution is already set up with Springer Nature.
So it's a bit like already having a SAML or a single sign-on,
right?
Sort of a little handshake going on with them.
Right. Okay, are you seeing my slides again?
I am, yes.
Okay, a look ahead. I'll be very brief here. We've already been across this. We hope that slowly and gradually more and more providers and subscribers will begin to implement this. It won't be sudden, it will be gradual, but then of course it took us a long time to embed IP filtering as deeply as it is, so it will take some time for us to begin to switch it out. By the way, a question that comes up is, if you do set this up with a vendor, then you will no longer be handling that vendor through your proxy server. And so the question often comes up, well, does that mean proxy servers are going away? Not a chance, not anytime soon. What I expect is that your major vendors, the ones that where most of your traffic is going, will move off the proxy server to this federated system. But it's very likely that small publishers and so forth that don't have much tech support and so forth are going to depend on IP filtering for quite some time. So we're looking at a gradual change in direction here, but not an abrupt change that's going to suddenly just make proxy servers disappear. You will depend less on proxy servers over time. There's a committee, I'm on it, working on some standardization of entity categories and use cases and so on. This link will take you to the future work items of the recommendations. One of the things that will probably be apparent to you is that where libraries often handle IP filtering entirely by themselves, maybe they ran their own proxy server, this collaboration or this federated identity management does mean that your campus IT group or whoever runs your identity provider needs to be more involved in the initial setup of these connections. So there's a considerable amount of communication and collaboration that will need to be developed between libraries and campus IT to make the provisioning of new connections flow smoothly. I'm not going to spend a lot more time here because we're just out of time. I could say a lot more about this, but I'll save that for perhaps another time. There are some real policy and procedure voids in library processes that are going to need to be rethought. This is just a partial list of entities that are involved in RA21 and also seamless access. It's somewhat out of date. And I'll end there. I would love to hear from you. Questions, comments, anything at all. This is a dynamic, fast-moving and complex undertaking, and I know it can be, at least for librarians to whom much of this is new, it can feel a little bit overwhelming. I hope to help make it less overwhelming. But I will stop there and simply say thanks very much for your time and attention, and please do let me hear from you if you're at all interested.
Thank you very much, Rich. We are out of time for questions, but Rich has got his contact details there, or if you want to post any further questions or anything you'd like more of an explanation onto the ANZREG list, we can share those with Rich through that medium as well. And we will have a recording of this webinar, and I'll see if I can get the slides themselves off Rich and have them posted to the ANZREG website. So definitely very big thank you to you, Rich. It was very interesting, and actually really does help clarify some of the, I guess, the upcoming changes that we're going to be seeing in this authentication space.
Right, I'll be more than happy to send you the slides.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.